Nākamais lektors, iesmas priekšu, mums ir no Zviedrijas, Klāfams institūta, kas ir Zviedrijas vadošais kristiešu domnīcas un pētniecības institūts, direktors tātad. Autors doktora disertācija par politiskajiem procesiem, kas veidoja Zviedriju par iespējams sekulārāko un individualistiskāko valsti pasaulē. Raksta iknedēļas ievadrakstus vienā no Zviedrijas kristīgajiem dienas laikrakstiem, kā arī ir autors 6 grāmatām, tostarp grāmatai nosaukumu The Land That Forgot God, jeb Zeme, kas aizmirsa Dievu. Ir precējies 4 bērni, un šodien mūsu uzmanībai viens no Zviedrijā visaktīvākajiem kristiešu sociālajiem debatētājiem ar lekciju Sekulārais individualisms un rietumi. Kā tas ietekmē ģimeni un sabiedrību, un kā Bībeles pasaules uzskats var būt alternatīva Eiropai šodien. Ar aplausiem sagaidām Pēru Ewertu no Zviedrijas.
Thank you everyone for welcoming me to the beautiful nation of Latvia. I told some people when we had breakfast this morning that I come from Sweden, and in the 1980s, quite few people would have imagined that you would go from Sweden to Latvia to breathe an air of freedom. But nowadays, I get that feeling that you can go outside the very special nation and the very special culture that I come from and breathe freely together with you people, Christians from different parts of the world, and also most of you, obviously, from the Baltics. And I'm very glad to be here and listen to the different talks that we've heard here, that are inspiring and informative, and I'll try to do my best for about an hour to share some things and experiences from Sweden and from Europe, and then have some time for questions and answers afterwards as well. So the topic today is about secular individualism and the West, and this is the topic that I did my doctorate on 1.5 years ago. And daily I lead a Christian think tank called the Clapham Institute, and obviously we get our inspiration from the Clapham sect and William Wilberforce in London some 200 years ago, with Christians from different parts of society trying to influence society with Christian values, and we do the same thing in Sweden. My doctoral dissertation was about well, the title was Moving Reality Closer to the Ideal, and that obviously comes from this vision of having such a strong political vision that you are prepared to move the reality itself in order to fulfill your vision. And this is taken from a quote from former Prime Minister Olof Palme, who described his party's policy to be like this. I also did a popularized version in Swedish called The Land That Forgot God, and this picture is from Swedish Parliament in the most liberated nation in the world, who has a large picture of grey, lifeless islands in the sea, and that is the picture that sort of summarizes perhaps the feeling in Sweden at this time. So this is, I'm a historian by academic profession, and I've been leading the Clapham Institute for 7 years now, is it? And I'm going to get back to a bit how we work. We work currently a lot with family issues that we're dealing with at this conference. But this story that I've done about the 20th century is kind of a detective story of what happened to a nation. And it's not always an encouraging story if you're a Christian, but it's good to have knowledge. So you know where you stand, how we got here, what forces we are currently under, and what direction we will take if we continue in the same direction, or if we want to re-evaluate things and do things otherwise and built on other foundations. But when I have been working as a historian, I've also written, I haven't got Swedish books with me, obviously, because few people understand Swedish, but I do have a few copies of an English book, which is this one. It's also a historical detective story. It's a story about that takes place at this particular time of the year, beginning on Ash Wednesday and ending on Easter morning. What would happen if the world's greatest detective were to investigate the most astonishing disappearance in human history? So I let Sherlock Holmes, together with, it's a novel, so you can create whatever you like. He meets an Anglican clergyman who has a modern problem he wants to have solved. So he comes to the famous detective with his modern problem, and he's also a New Testament scholar. So together they investigate the ancient history problem and the modern one. So that's a way of telling the foundations of the gospel, the historical foundations of the gospel. You can bring it with you or to a friend afterwards. So we will currently focus on not only Sweden, not only Latvia, but about the values that affect the whole world. And I think a lot of you are familiar with this chart. It comes from the World Values Survey describing the nations in the world. And the further right you go on this chart, the more individualistic the values are in the nation. And the further up you go, the more secular. And as you realize, the former communist nations belonging to the Soviet bloc, they mostly belong to the left-hand scale. They're not individualistic, they're very group-oriented. That's part of the heritage of communism. You see the Baltic states are here somewhere in the middle, quite secular, but not as individualistic as the Protestant nations to the right, where I happen to live in the most extreme nation on earth. It is extreme. I was in a TV interview the other day who asked this question, are we extreme? Yes, we are, empirically speaking, both historically and comparatively to other nations. And what's important is, as you heard in the former speech about the things going on within the European Union, is that we have the same forces going on all across Europe. The only thing is that they have been stronger in Sweden. And that's why I think it's helpful to know the Swedish experience, because what has happened in our nation will also affect other nations. And this is a chart of values that I'd like to show you that I have found helpful in my empirical studies. I've studied the value of autonomy, the self-law in Greek, where the self, the independence of the individual becomes the most important value of all. And this is a center of individualistic movements, and also quite often a center of secular movements. But in popular debate and in law and politics, people rarely stand on the main square and say, the independence of the individual is the highest good of all. Quite often, this turns out as opposition against three values. Community, especially in form of the family, because people might argue and say, oh, the family might trap you and tie you down. The individual must break free from the family. It also opposes authority, in general, all kinds of authorities, because the authority stands above the individual independence. And also, very interestingly, it also opposes the sacred, which in our Christian tradition is obviously connected to God, the Bible, church, and so on. So I think this is helpful in understanding the values and the debates that we experience in all our nations, where the autonomous philosophy stands out and proposes individual independence and against these factors, ultimately ending up in what I call ultra-progressivism, where the autonomy is the only thing that matters, regardless of other needs in society. There's one more chart I'd like to show you to compare the different cultures that our nations may be in. Obviously, no culture is solely one of these. But if we say that a society consists of three factors: the state, the individual, and the family, and church, civil society, if you like, to combine these. If we take a model and call it the German model, where the state and the family work together in a number of ways, and the individual sort of falls in the background. But there are cultures that are individualistic, but there are different kinds of individualism. For instance, the American version works together, the individual, with civil society, with family, with church, and so on. That's based on the American tradition. But what has happened in a truly autonomous culture is that the individual can't be by him or herself all the time, fleeting around as atoms, because that would create chaos and anarchy. That's why we in Sweden, through deliberate political actions, have connected the state and the individual very closely. And we see a lot of practical examples of that in our nations, and you've heard that in the news in some ways, I expect, and you see patterns of it in several nations, but the Swedish example is very strong. Now, my empirical and doctoral work was about secularism and individualism, and we see a strong secular trend in the world, have seen for the last century. Here is one famous quote on Time magazine calling the question, "Is God dead?" And people imagined that in the 1960s. And there is also a trend, especially in America, this is in America, where you see the number of Christians gradually decreasing and the number of religiously unaffiliated moving upwards. And one might think that, yeah, this might give the idea that the Soviet idea of atheism has prevailed, but it hasn't. That is not the case, because this movement seems to be reshaping and catching on other values than just denying God. If you see, Google is a good way of showing what people search for and what things are up to date in popular discussion. And you see that over time, the search for atheism-related words are decreasing. But it seems that they're reshaping into other things that are connected to the same movement, but not primarily denying the existence of God. You see values and things like racism, sexism, patriarchy, and white supremacy. These are exploding in internet searches, which sort of gives a picture of what is going on. And simultaneously, the movement of atheism is having a hard time. And this is one quite clear picture of it. There was the World Atheist Convention in 2018 called Reason to Hope. There is no God, there is no hope beyond the grave, there is no point to life, is cancelled due to lack of interest. That is quite interesting, you have to tell. So this movement saying that there is no God and we have to sort of build our life around that, that is weak, but it's reshaping into this identity political field instead. And if we were to look upon Europe and what has happened during the last 500 years, let's do a 2-minute overview on the history of thought of Western Europe. Can we manage? I'll help you through it. Because Europe is built on biblical foundations, but something has happened from the Reformation and onwards, and especially from the Renaissance and onwards. You know, the Reformation was built on biblical values, but you saw that some kind of crack opens during the Renaissance where man, instead of God, begins to come closer to the center. And if you move on through the philosophers from Descartes saying that, yes, obviously there is a God, but we begin with cogito ergo sum, we begin with myself and what I think. We go on to David Hume, where doubt is becoming the virtue. We begin to doubt more and more, and that's what we should do. And that sort of explodes when we invent the guillotine and we chop off the heads of those that don't accept the new rule and the new ideas. But they spread around Europe during the late 1700s and early 1800s through Enlightenment and Revolution. And the 1800s propels things even faster, where Kant, not far away from here, in Königsberg, says, okay, we have morals, but we have no foundation. You remember this talk we heard yesterday, which connects very well to this. So those of you who weren't here yesterday, perhaps you could hear that speech by, what's his name again? Geoffrey Barrow, yeah. So do come back to that. I'd recommend it. And we carry on to Hegel, who says that we have no absolutes at all. There are no antitheses. Everything is the same. Carrying on to Karl Marx, who said that, okay, we skip God now. We just wait for the revolution and then heaven on earth will appear. On to Nietzsche, who say, okay, yes, we skip God, but we have to create the Übermensch ourselves and create the wonderful society. And then we move on, obviously, into the 1900s, where your nation has experienced a lot of the two leaders, which are obviously not philosophers, but creating policy based on the philosophers in the 1800s of Hitler and Stalin. And then we go on to our own time, the 21st century, where the woke philosophy has become the leading philosophy in a lot of the Western world, in different strengths in different nations, but it is still a very strong philosophy, and we need to understand it, evaluate it, show its weaknesses, and discuss what effects does it actually have for society. And concerning my own nation, you can see and find the doctoral dissertation on the internet and read about the development there, but I'll summarize some interesting things. I typically say that Sweden have had 7 secular apostles during the 1900s, and these were never prime ministers, never party leaders, but still extremely influential in shaping my nation. 2 of them worked with church policy. These are Arthur Engberg and Harald Hallén. Arthur Engberg moved up hating Christianity, doing everything he could to destroy it. He wrote books, he wrote articles, he went into politics, saying that where socialism comes in, Christianity goes out, and vice versa. We are in opposition to each other, and I'd like to combat Christianity. And he did so by influencing the church from within. First starting to have the idea to abolish the state church, then realizing, together with the gentleman below, you see, he couldn't be in opposition to Christianity. He was a clergyman in the Church of Sweden, but above all, he was a loyal party servant of the Social Democratic Party. And together, they reshaped the Church of Sweden to a completely new form of church, not appearing anywhere in the world, not anywhere either in countries that have had Lutheran state churches, where the parties control the church, especially then the Social Democratic Party. The other area is the school, and we've had 2 leading figures. One is Alva Myrdal, who you may have heard of. She received the Nobel Peace Prize at an older age. She had worked a lot with nuclear disarmament and stuff. She worked closely together with Stellan Arvidsson, who was very devout in his pursuance of creating the secular and individualistic world. And he did so together with his long-time partnership with, he was for, I think it was 3 decades almost, the chairman of the Sweden-East Germany Friendship Association. This paradise on earth, perhaps not today, but probably the day after tomorrow. And East Germany and Sweden would together form the free paradise on earth without God and without connections. Philosophy is obviously an important part if you want to change a country. This may be Sweden's most influential philosopher during the 20th century. His name is Axel Hägerström, and he was the father of value nihilism, saying that there is no absolute moral values. You have to come up with everything yourself and feel what is right or wrong, which is basically a summary of the autonomous culture, where each man and woman, him or herself, decides what is right and wrong. And in the mid-1900s, Ingmar Hedenius wrote a book called Faith and Knowledge, saying that if you Christians have a rational foundation for your faith, show it. Otherwise, we all go into atheism. And the sad thing is that bishops and other Christian leaders, they caved down and referred to some inner faith in the heart, which is fine, but it's not the rational foundation that he asked for. And therefore, the atheists won a lot of the battle in the 1950s in Sweden. And finally, culture is an important area if you want to shape a nation. Who is the dominating cultural figure in Sweden from the last century? Well, most people would say Ingmar Bergman, who did so many of his films to rebel against his father on earth, the priest, and our Father who is in heaven. And these are 7 people, very devout in their striving to create the new liberated society, especially Alva Myrdal, whom we're going to come back to, who was involved in all areas that changed Sweden into a new society. trying to liberate people from both God and from families, because family ties are dangerous to the child, was her message. And the authority of the teacher is also dangerous, so we need to remove all that. And she, together with the others, succeeded quite much in what they achieved. And obviously, as My Nation took that fruits of what it would be like creating a society built on these values, we currently eat those fruits. And if you see the news from Sweden, you see some of the results from it, of gang violence, bombings, murders, well, a lot of things, sinking results in school, and so on and so forth. So if we were to summarize in a picture the modern project, we could see there are two possible ultimate authorities over a church, obviously, and over a society. And these are God, and it's the independent man. So what happened in My Nation, to summarize the process, a large political and philosophical and other processes in one picture, would be that the power and the authority was transferred from God to the independent man. And this is the fruits that we currently eat in our society. Now, the process of reshaping Sweden was performed in 3 battlefields, and I think this is quite telling that they took place in this particular order that I'll show you, and that also shows perhaps some experiences that could be useful for other nations to learn from if you want to be like Sweden, or to learn not to follow that example if you don't want to follow the Swedish pathway. Because the first area to change was actually the church, the Lutheran state church, which the politicians could control and dominate. They couldn't understand the other churches, and because the politicians couldn't control them. But they did a lot of reshaping and taking over the power over the state church. And when the weapons had been taken away, if we call it a prophetic weapon from the church, it was much easier to proceed into the other areas, which were the school and finally the family. The school was secularized and strongly individualized in the 1960s, and then in the late 1960s and early 1970s, Sweden became the strongest example in the world of a radical individualized family policy. And these forces and these values affect other nations in the world too. We've heard that in the last speech, and how to handle them in the field of law, and there are other fields that we could discuss and work in these areas and for the values that we believe in. So let me say something about school, because as we're dealing with family and individuals and society here, the school is an important area if you want to change the society. And Olof Palme said that when he was Minister of Ecclesiastical Affairs up until 1968. We called it that. One minister had the responsibility over both church and school, because the church started the schools in Sweden. But the idea is, you see here former Prime Minister Magdalena Andersson, who lost her job a little bit more than a year ago. We now have Ulf Kristersson as Prime Minister for the moderate party, as they call it, the liberal conservative. But she was leading the Social Democratic Party. And she stood here a few weeks before the election saying that there are still some remains of Christianity and religion in school, and we need to get rid of these. There are some Christian schools in Sweden, we need to shut them down. She says confessional schools, saying that there's equal trouble with everything, but it's just a few Muslim schools and some 60 Christian schools. But they need to shut down because religion has no place in school whatsoever. And she did so standing before the St. Hans School, which is a bit of a paradox. And there seems to be some kind of text above the door. Shall we zoom in and see? Let's see if we have some Latin experts here. Timor Dei initium sapientiae. Can anyone help us out with the translation?
The fear of God is, or respect over God, is the beginning of wisdom.
The fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. Isn't that a bit fun? That the Prime Minister stands and proclaims that we need to get rid of religion in school because it has no place there. And she does so standing before a sign saying the opposite. But they worked thoroughly in removing religion from Swedish schools in the 1960s. And they did so in the high school, in the gymnasium first. And there was a huge debate. There was 42% of the voting population in Sweden signed a petition not to remove the teaching of Christianity. That's the largest popular opinion show in Sweden ever. But they still decided to go through with it because they found this to be so central in the new project they were shaping, to remove the teaching of Christianity and exchange it for knowledge of religion, which could be neutral and nice, but it wasn't. It was manifestly anti-Christian, where they wrote, for instance, that we don't read about God and Jesus anymore, but with God faith and Christ faith with small letters, but with capital letters we read those who understand and explain what religion is, Marx and Freud. They said that we should have special focus on the positive impact of naturalism, and obviously, very neutrally put, discuss religion as an obsessive compulsive disorder with infantile features. So if you would find that neutral, I would probably disagree. So this was the national curriculum, the national curriculum, but in order to change a school system, you need to change also other areas. For instance, the textbooks. And Stellan Arvidsson, you remember, the chairman of the Sweden-East Germany Friendship Association, who was leading behind the scenes in reshaping the school system. He also wrote textbooks describing what religion is, in his view, and promoting the secular individualism that has been so strong in Sweden. And also, he was the leader of the government committee reshaping the teacher colleges. And when you have reshaped these, you have changed the nation for a generation or two. And then followed the primary schools. And in 1969, everything was completed. And in 1969, you know, when I did this study, I went to archives looking for text materials and also for pictures. And I found one picture that I've never seen printed anywhere before, but it's really telling of what has happened. This is an older Stellan Arvidsson standing next to, does anyone recognize the gentleman to the left? Anyone from Germany, perhaps? This is East Germany's first Minister of Education, Stellan Arvidsson's close friend, Paul Wandel. And this is the day at the university in Rostock in East Germany, where Stellan Arvidsson receives the honorary doctorate for having performed such a wonderful task, almost single-handedly in a nation. And this is his speech where he receives this honorary doctorate, saying that what I have done in Sweden is to begin shaping a socialistisk Gesellschaft, a socialist society, and preparing for socialism. Saying this out frankly. This is very bold. And one interesting comment that he does is that he says that in the future, the historians must investigate how a socialist school system could be built in a capitalist country. And no one had undertaken such a study, so I decided to do it myself. And it's not been entertaining, but I think it's been very important, both for Sweden and for other nations, to show the historic lines and the strategies used in order to shape a nation. And we currently stand in a school system which is indeed very secular. And here are some of the reports that we've done in the Clapham Institute. These three are about different ways of showing the school system in Sweden and the regulations and legislation surrounding it, and why international law still gives a large freedom for Christian schools, for instance, and for Christian values in education. And currently, in the Institute, we're working on a report on family research, which is basically showing what we want to show in this conference, that functioning families and marriages are beneficial to individuals and society. That's an intuitive truth that we know, but we've shown it in international research, and we'll publish that in a few months, hopefully. So about family then. The family policy in Sweden was, for a long time, quite traditional, like it was in most nations, because people liked that, and people understood that this was beneficial for society. This is a picture from a family conference in the leading Social Democrats in 1956. The Prime Minister, Tage Erlander, in the speaker's booth, the women's organization, the youth organization, together arranging a conference called The Family at the Center. This could have been this conference, because almost everyone in Sweden agreed that this is a good foundation for society. But there were a few very deliberate and very strong and very devout individuals who decided, we have another vision. We want to tear down the foundations that have been built because we like the individual to be free from everything. And here is one conclusion that I've made, is that individual actors are important in shaping a society. And here is a picture which is fascinating that I found in the archives. Here is a very young Alva Myrdal, actually she's called Alva Reimer, and this is the first day that she meets Gunnar Myrdal, also a Nobel laureate, very famous. Both these two were very famous and very active and successful in their lives and careers. He received the Nobel Prize in economy because he was an economist. And this is the first day that they met, and her father had a camera, and they took a photo of them. And I wrote in the text to this picture in the book that after this day, nothing would ever be the same again. Because 15 years later, they wrote a book called Crisis in the Population Issue, where they said that, okay, we have too few babies born in Sweden. So they got the job to write a book about it. And very strangely, some of their suggestions were to have more contraceptives, more abortions, and more forced sterilizations. And one wonders whether that would create more babies. Probably not, but that was part of the vision of creating the new liberated society. Very few people listened to them because they were too extreme, but they kept to their vision. And 40 years later, it came to fruition. This is the Congress, the Social Democratic Party Congress in 1975, where they adopted a new party program. They had by this time governed Sweden for 43 consecutive years. That's the longest period of a single political party in the democratic West. And they did a lot of things during these 43 and ultimately 44 years. And the point that was central in the party program was the following. Family legislation, taxes, and social policy are to be designed with respect to the family members being independent individuals. And this was the final point of a policy that they have been undertaking for years. Not many years, but the late 1960s and the early 1970s. For instance, by this small brochure by the Women's Association, you see by the color what is the point of it. The family in the future, a socialist family policy, where we await the revolution together with our children. And remember, this is a social democratic. This is not a communist party brochure, but a social democratic, following the same ultimate goal. And there are two defining documents from 1969 that open the gate to this. One is published also in English. This is a report to the party congress led by Alva Myrdal that says, obviously, they see that they like equality, and most of us would say, yes, equality is a good thing, but the point of it and the vision behind it was a radical version of autonomy, disconnecting the family members from each other. And they did so in, very few people have read this. This is an internal report from the Department of Finances in Sweden. Not a public report, but an internal report, which is important because it redefined the family in legislation. And as we heard in the last talk, law is important because laws set the rules for a society. And what they did is that they replaced a community-oriented view of the family with an autonomous, saying that we used to treat marriage as an actual and economic community, changing this to saying that husband and wife are independent of the other spouse. And when this definition was made, the other processes just could roll on up till where we are today. So when we are in our societies, one might feel like the little boy with a sling, the David, against the huge Goliath who boasts and says, I will control everything. There is nothing he can do against me. And when I have these talks in Sweden, I typically leave people in a quite low view of themselves and of society and of hope, some sort of midway. And then I try to catch them up again. And I'll try to do the same with you now. So are you okay with that? Yes. So when we feel that we are in the David versus Goliath situation, first, who won the battle? Yes. So how do we do it? How do we treat these forces and these values that we meet in society? Well, one conclusion that I made in my research is that secularism and individualism are intertwined. And that's very important to remember. If you run one of them, the other is likely to follow. And when you propagate autonomy in a culture, it is bound to result in continued secular individualism. And it's not something that only I say. It's several scholars that draw the same conclusion, that autonomy is the central driving force behind this. And if you are in a culture where there is a lot of hostility against community, for instance in the family, and against authority and the sacred, this will lead to secularization. But on the other hand, if we have a sound defense of these, we don't defend everything. We know there are families that don't work well, there are churches that don't work well, and there are authorities that are bad. But there are also versions of these that may form a sound and good and solid foundation for today and for the future. And if we defend and communicate these as we are in churches, as we are as individuals, in our work life, and so on, that could help in opposing the other trends. And also, when I give talks, I typically point to a fire extinguisher. I don't see one in this room, but I would assume that they have one at the hotel somewhere. If you look on the instructions of a fire extinguisher, they typically say, aim at the base of the fire. That's strange, isn't it? I mean, it's the flames that are huge and strong and dangerous. But in reality, they're just a reflection of what is actually burning, the base of the fire. And that's why it says you have to aim your counterforce against the base of the fire, like we heard in the speech yesterday, about the foundations, about the ideas behind everything, because they give the practical consequences that we see in media, in politics, and so on. So when you meet all these things that you would consider strange or destructive, you could debate them, but you could especially debate and attack the foundation which you find false. And there are obviously, when we are in nations that have large secular groups, we can connect to them in specific questions. Some questions, the left have more of the view of reality in certain questions. In other questions, the right have more knowledge of the truth. And as a Clapham Institute, we work together with left-wing groups in some areas, right-wing groups in some areas, those that are connected to what we find to be truth and just. And we can do that. And I think we must do that, wisely, obviously, that we still remain on our own foundation. And finally then, we can communicate and we can defend both truth and righteousness and love, but not particularly the love that is communicated in our present-day culture, which is basically about me getting what I want, but about the agape love, which is the love that gives yourself to someone else, the biblical version of love. It's not always that the secular society would say, hey, church, come to us and give us what you have. But they need it, because we have taken a long route down this path that we've been strongest in the world in Sweden, but also affecting the other nations, and we've seen the fruits of it. And quite a lot of people realize that everything has not been the paradise on earth that we longed for. So let me conclude by showing you 3 examples that are paradoxical in a number of ways, but really telling, and I've learned a lot from them, and possibly you can as well. One thing, as I said, that it doesn't take so many individuals to change a nation. The 7 people I showed on the pictures, they were just 7. But they were very devout to what they saw as their vision. Few individuals have changed nations before. It can happen again. You may think that you can do some of things yourself, and you can also inspire others. And that's one example I'm going to give you, which is very strange for me personally. Because the first book I wrote was not about history and religion and stuff, but it was a textbook about social science for Swedish schools, Swedish junior high schools. And I was quite satisfied with it. We put a picture of a young girl who went by train to protest at a UN meeting on the cover, and I put some ideas, some suggestions in the text of how to influence society using media, talking to politicians, and creating opinion. And then I put that book away. They started to sell that, and I went further to doing research and writing books on apologetics and so on. But in the meantime, apparently there was a little girl who didn't want to go to school, so she brought her school books with her and sat protesting outside Parliament instead. And only after a while did I look closer to the picture and realize, wait a minute. And this, obviously, this is not a question of what is positive or negative in the Greta movement. Let's skip that question. But the point is, my point is that 1 year later, this little girl had been not most influential in her class or in her school, but in the entire world. And I have no idea to what extent she was influenced by my book. But anyway, anyone can influence anyone. And anyone can influence perhaps people that have access and changing a lot in society, or just individual persons. And here I have an example that I've never shared actually in a public speech before, but it comes very handy here because we are in the town where this thing happened that I'm showing you. And this is a little box we have on the piano in our home. It's not bigger than this. It's made of straw and this material, and it comes from this town. And this is such a fascinating story that if I didn't have it on my piano, I wouldn't believe that it was true. But this box belonged to my wife's grandfather. She has never met her grandfather. Neither has my mother-in-law. This box is from 1943, and I know it is. And at that time, my wife's grandmother was fleeing East Prussia together with her 3 little children, whereof the last one is the newborn baby, who is my mother-in-law. And they were fleeing, like most German women were, from the Red Army when they were coming. And in the meantime, her husband was a devout Christian who was in the German army, but did not have to wear arms, which he was glad for. So he was sent to this town to be a guard at the prisoner of war camp, just a few kilometers from here, by the river. Very, very fascinating to be here. And he never came home from there. So neither my wife nor her mother has ever met her father. But what came back after the war was his few belongings, which is one of these is this box. And he didn't buy it himself. He received it as a gift. And you can see that on the inside, which I'm going to show you. He had received this from his prisoners because he was a Christian who shared the Bible with them and read the Bible to them and showed that there is another vision of life opposed to this, what you see from Nazism and from communism. So on the inside of this box, they wrote this poem and gave it to him as a gift, saying in German, with best wishes to the Honorable Herr Obergefreiter, Corporal Herr Hans Siebald, on your birthday. Russian War Prisoner Command, Riga, 25th of May, 1943. He never came home. We don't know how he died, but he died here, just a few kilometers away. And we have that box on our piano now as a remembrance of, just family background, of course, but also I would assume there are few German guards that received a birthday gift from Soviet war prisoners. But this was another kind of person who showed that there is light in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. And to finalize, I'll give you one Swedish example. This is the old Arthur Engberg. You remember the gentleman who was a very angry young man, doing whatever he could to destroy Christianity, even using the church to destroy Christianity from within. This is the older Arthur Engberg when he has left politics, and if you look on his face, you see that he seems somewhat more peaceful. Because one thing he did and got involved in when he was Minister of Ecclesiastical Affairs was they revised the Swedish hymn book in the church. And if you have a state church, the leading politician could take part in revising the hymn book. And apparently, he got influenced by it. In his younger years, he studied for Axel Hägerström and was influenced by the autonomous philosophy that changed so much in Sweden. In his older years, he was more influenced by the hymn book. And 1.5 years ago, I met an elderly man, I happened to meet him, who is an old man now, but when he was young, he wrote a biography over Arthur Engberg, together with his father, who interviewed the priest who sat together with Arthur Engberg on the day he died. And there's close you get to history. And he told me that on the day he died, of course it's a long process, but he received communion and died as a Christian believer. But oh, how he had torn down the kingdom of God and the church while he was active politician. So he was buried in his home village, which is in the exact geographical middle of Sweden. And here is the final paradox of it all. As it is in the exact geographical middle of Sweden, 20 years ago, some Christian got a vision to raise Sweden's and one of the world's tallest crosses, showing that there is another kingdom that will last when all political projects have run their race, when all individual politicians and other world leaders have run their race, and that will stand forever. And we who are Christians, we belong to that kingdom, and we work for that kingdom. Regardless if we feel that it's an uphill slope sometime, we see that this is a kingdom that will prevail in the end. So thank you for listening.
You mentioned about woke philosophy. Could you tell us a bit more? What is that?
At the center of the woke philosophy is this autonomous philosophy. Of course, they borrow language from a Christian worldview, the way you get awakened. But the point is that you need to get free of all bonds, philosophical, human, and liberate yourself to whatever you feel like. And obviously, we see different versions of it in society and in our different nations. But I guess that is a summary of the autonomous philosophy running all the way to its ultimate end. And we sort of at the end of a pendulum, one could almost say, and we see in some, if I just follow up on the question, perhaps there are follow-up questions on this. We have seen in Sweden and perhaps in other nations too, that when a pendulum swings too far away from the center of gravity or reality, it has a tendency to fall back. And we see that in some areas, and that's why I think that we as Christians, we should help the pendulum falling back, rather than following society, trying to pull it further away from reality.
Okay, thank you for that. One of the most voted for question. What is the current situation in Swedish schools? What is the effect of Christian education? I'll give you a brief example for Latvia, one of the regional schools that I'm in the parental board. I experienced that they took out the Christian lessons as such with the mention that they will integrate the idea in the rest of the spectrum of lessons, basically, which you don't really feel. So the question.
we see the results of this progressive movement, if we call it the progressive school. The proponents often call it that, where you progress into the new society where the individual stands free and finds knowledge, him or herself. We see in the PISA investigations, you have those in your nations as well, where you follow the knowledge results in schools, and we see that they are continually lowering in Sweden. Because in 1969, where they adopted the new school system, finally in all schools in Sweden, Olof Palme, he declared in Parliament, we have 4 goals in school, and none of them had anything to do with knowledge, but just creating the new person. And of course, if you don't have an authority in school, if you don't have a focus on knowledge in school, you will have certain results. You see similar trends in other nations as well. We are all part of the same trends, but some of these cases are stronger in Sweden. And there is also a strong anti-Christian bias. And there have been doctoral dissertations done on this too, showing that in classroom there is a strong hostility against general religion, and especially against Christianity, because Muslim pupils seem to be more bold and outspoken about their faith, which is interesting. If they are outspoken about their faith, perhaps Christian pupils and adults should be able to be more outspoken too.
Good point, thank you. What does it mean to you to speak the truth in Sweden, and what has it cost you?
That's a personal question. Are we on tape still?
I would count that you are.
Okay, then I'll answer it in more general terms. It has a personal cost, both when you have a job and sometimes when you lose a job. And the main problem is that I published this dissertation and this book in Sweden, and quite a lot of people have been interested in it and bought it and so on and spread it. But those that are most affected by it, the leaders in politics and the leaders in church, have been quite reluctant, because it's challenging to bring up the question, has everything really gone well when we have exchanged one value system for another? So the main response I have received is silence. The other is attacking me personally in some ways, but one positive thing is that one gentleman who attacked me very personally in a newspaper this summer has come back, and I think we will find some way of coming together. And well, let's see what turns out. But I think we will go to have a good public discussion in a week or two, because I think it is important to talk about the truth, not to avoid it. Saying this is truth as it is today, both the dark sides and the light sides of it, and also to evaluate what has happened and how we ended up here, and what we think about it, because there is such a strong tendency to avoid the truth, because the truth is tough. But we need to discuss that in order, like Jesus says, obviously, that the truth shall set us free.
So it sounds like you are for building bridges with the absolutely opposite opinions.
Talk to them, talk about it, challenge them, talk about the truth issues, not letting them get away with a project that seems absurd in a number of ways, and not discussing them openly. Discuss the propositions, the philosophical foundations, the consequences. Discuss it all.
And I guess one of the challenges there is, especially in the woke culture where we're in, is that one of the symptoms of it, as I've noticed, is that it is difficult for them to see or receive the corrections.
In one way, as the woke culture rejects truth, but no person lives that way, consequentially. I mean, no person goes to the bank and says, there is no truth. I would like to know what is in my account. No person goes to the doctor, the cancer doctor, and says, it doesn't matter, there is no such thing as truth or lie. We would like to know, do I have it or do I not? Do I have a chance of surviving or not? And so on. So challenge people, challenge the culture with the truth.
Okay, next question. How has the predominance of women teachers in schools influenced the development and maintenance of faith-based education where God as the Father?
It's an interesting question. I don't think that is a major issue. Since schools began in the 1842, we began compulsory school in Sweden. And those that were not, the teaching that was not done by the priest or his right-hand man was most often done by unmarried women. And they based their teaching on a clearly Christian curriculum. So I don't think that is a top thing. That is the discussion within church, obviously, as they introduced female clergy in Sweden in 1958, that was a huge discussion, which was basically not about the gender issue in church, but basically about what is the foundation for a church? Is it scripture or is it political ideas? And the political ideas won. And then the Church of Sweden have received a dominance of female clergy. And of course, I think that has changed the identity of the church.
Okay, and on the same subject, how has the liberalization of women shaped Swedish politics?
Yeah, I think that goes together. Obviously, as we saw, the title of the Alva Myrdal book, Towards Equality, most of us would agree that equality is good, equality is a biblical value. Paul speaks about it. We who are rich, we help the poor, and so on. There is neither Jew nor Greek, nor man nor woman. But the idea behind this ultra-feminist movement is obviously a version of Marxism, saying that there are classes, there are different groups, and one battles with each other, and that creates this conflict scenario that we have, and that is obviously harmful in a number of ways.
What will be your main suggestion to Latvian conservatives? What to do to avoid situation that Sweden is in right now?
Well, one thing is to learn from the Swedish example. If you don't want to follow the Swedish example, you should look at this philosophical foundation, the autonomous philosophy, which has influenced Sweden so strongly through culture, through philosophy, through obviously political decisions. And in all areas where you work and where you are and where you haven't possibility to influence others, discuss those foundations and you know, if you think that another foundation is more valuable to society, such as love, agape love, and the biblical foundations and the biblical values, promote them and make sure you talk about the concrete measures that are discussed. In each of these areas, there were one particular area of conflict. In the church, it was the power of the church and the female clergy, but the basic question was the authority of the church. In school, it was the teaching of Christianity, and in family, it was, is the marriage a community or two separate individuals? In all of these, both the proponent and the opposed position realize that this is a crucial question because it focuses on what is the ultimate authority, and is there a community or an autonomous perspective? And then if you believe in community, in family, and good authorities, you should promote that.
Okay, we still have some time. So you spoke about the secular apostles. So what, perhaps you know, were the experiences of the secular apostles with their fathers? How did the experience of the relationship with their fathers affect them?
This is a really interesting question. I don't know the background of all of them regarding their fathers, but when it comes to family issues, a lot of them were, shall we say, norm creative in their family life. For instance, I haven't spoken about the three prime ministers. The first one, Per Albin Hansson, he fell down on the train platform in 1946 on the way home to one of his two families. He had two. And that was well known by the press, but they didn't write about it, apart from also his secretary at the office. And he wrote about all three of them in his diary. So it is well known that he spent his time with three women. And so did a lot of the others. So it seems to be a connection between sometimes the personal norms that you want to live as liberal as possible, and then putting your own family ideas into legislation, and that has created the situation where we are. That's part of it.
Okay, thank you. Great answer. A little bit of change of subject in the defense of autonomy, I suppose. I'll try to translate this one. Is autonomy, since autonomy is not desirable because it goes together with individualism, but it is thanks to it that in Sweden you didn't have forced vaccinations, but in Latvia over 60,000 people lost their jobs.
Precisely, and that's why I said that the value that is at the center of this is autonomy, not individualism. There are good versions of individualism. In Sweden, there were two, can we call it theological trends in the mid-1800s, who both focused on the individual. One of them focused on the revival movement, the individual coming in a personal relationship with God, and the other, which began moving God out of the picture altogether, finally ending up in practical atheism. So there are biblical versions of individualism, very clearly. And that also goes back to the Reformation with Luther's message of connecting the individual and the scripture back to its roots. But it happened to take also the other direction, the possible direction in individualism, which disconnected God from it all. So if we think that the individual should be connected to something, it should perhaps be not just the state, but also other factors like family, civil society, and God.
Okay, and the last question, perhaps. Where do you draw the line between community-orientedness and collectivism? The secular project says that they are for the community, just one big one.
Precisely. That is a good point. Probably often they don't use the word community, but they rather use the word collectivism. Olof Palme was once asked which one he preferred, and he says, the question is not whether we should have collectivism or not. The question is what kind of collectivism we should have. And he suggested an individualistic collectivism. And that sounds absurd. But that is the state individualism that we have built in Sweden, disconnecting the individual from family and so on. But I believe that, and I would say that a lot of Swedes would say that the fruits have not been entirely good in this project. And that's why we perhaps need to connect the individual to better sources.
That individual collectivism sounds like something out of an Orwellian book or something.
Not bad.
Okay, do you see signs of hope in Sweden and then perhaps for Latvia as well?
Yes, obviously, because as I said, with the pendulum swinging too far away from reality, it has a tendency to fall back. And it's not from Sweden, but perhaps you read the article a couple of months ago by Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who grew up as a Muslim. She had tried everything in the Muslim worldview, then moved over and seen that, okay, radical Muslims, they drive their airplanes into high buildings. That's not a good ideology. She gave her focus to the secular individualism and was one of the leaders in the new atheistic movement. But she realized also that didn't lead to happiness on earth. And a couple of months ago, she wrote an article saying, "Why I am now a Christian." And that's a sign of a person who truly searches what is in this worldview and what are the consequences of it. And if we believe that Christianity is the truth and a sound worldview that creates good values for society, we should stand boldly by it. So God bless you all. Thanks for welcoming me here.
Pēc sevis.